Picture this. It's around 40,000 years ago, somewhere in ancient Europe, and a hunting group has just had a spectacular day. They brought down an aurochs earlier in the afternoon, which is already a significant accomplishment given that an aurochs is essentially a cow that hasn't been asked to be polite yet. And now, while processing the carcass, they've attracted the attention of three wolves who have settled at a respectful distance downwind and are watching the proceedings with the focused attention of animals conducting a professional assessment of their options. The hunters notice the wolves. The wolves notice the hunters noticing them. Everyone proceeds with their respective activities while maintaining the specific mutual awareness that characterizes encounters between ancient humans and large carnivores in territory both species consider theirs. Eventually, the hunters take what they can carry and leave. The wolves move in to investigate what remains. This has probably happened dozens of times in this specific territory with these specific wolves, and there's a loose, wary coexistence that neither party would describe as comfortable, but that both parties have clearly found workable. Here's the thing nobody in that scene is thinking: those wolves look like a food source. The thought doesn't cross anyone's mind, not because the wolves aren't made of meat, which they clearly are, and which ancient humans understood very well, but because eating a wolf involves a cost-benefit calculation that comes out negative in several ways simultaneously. This video is about all of those ways. So here's the real question this video investigates. Why did ancient humans so consistently avoid eating carnivores even when they were hungry, even when carnivores were present, even when other food sources were limited? The answer is considerably more layered, more practically specific, and more biologically interesting than most people assume, and it connects to ancient human ecological intelligence in ways that reveal something important about how our ancestors thought about the natural world around them. Stick around because this topic goes considerably deeper than the obvious answers and emerges at a genuinely interesting conclusion about ancient human dietary strategy. Start with the honest baseline. The statement that ancient humans never ate carnivores is not quite accurate as an absolute claim, and being precise about where it's accurate and where it needs qualification is important for understanding the real story. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient humans did occasionally process and consume some carnivores, with lion, leopard, hyena, and wolf bones appearing at some ancient sites with cut marks indicating human butchery. So the behavior wasn't completely absent. But the frequency and scale of carnivore consumption in the ancient dietary record is strikingly low compared to herbivore consumption, and the disparity is large enough to constitute a meaningful pattern that deserves explanation rather than being dismissed as random variation. The question, properly framed, is why carnivore consumption was so consistently and dramatically underrepresented relative to herbivore consumption in ancient human dietary patterns, given that carnivores were present in ancient human environments and ancient humans were capable of hunting them. Several answers operate simultaneously, and understanding all of them together produces a much more complete picture than any single explanation provides. The most immediately practical answer involves caloric economics, the basic calculation of energy obtained versus energy expended that determines whether any food acquisition effort is worth undertaking. Herbivores are, calorie for calorie and kilogram for kilogram, significantly more efficient food sources than carnivores for reasons rooted in how energy moves through food chains. Every step up a food chain involves substantial energy loss because animals at each level burn most of the energy they consume in their own metabolic processes before any of it becomes available to whatever eats them. A herbivore eating grass converts roughly 10% of the grass's energy into body mass. A carnivore eating that herbivore converts roughly 10% of the herbivore's energy into its own body mass. By the time you're eating a carnivore, you're at the third or fourth step in a chain that has been losing 90% of its energy. At each transfer, which means carnivore bodies contain dramatically less stored energy per unit of feeding effort and metabolic investment than herbivore bodies of comparable size. This energy density difference manifests in the specific way that matters most for ancient human dietary strategy: fat content. Ancient human nutritional needs in cold climates and high-activity lifestyles required significant dietary fat, and fat content in prey animals was one of the primary considerations in ancient hunting decisions, as we've discussed across multiple earlier videos in this series. Herbivores, particularly those that have been building fat reserves ahead of winter, can contain substantial fat deposits in predictable locations that experienced ancient hunters knew how to locate and prioritize. Carnivores, especially those living in environments where food is scarce and inconsistent, tend to be leaner, with less accumulated fat relative to body mass, making them less calorically valuable per unit of effort even when the effort of catching them could be managed. The effort calculation is the second major factor, and it's one that ancient humans were well positioned to understand through accumulated experience, even without any formal framework for evaluating it. Carnivores are, almost by definition, physically capable, alert, aggressive, and equipped with weapons, specifically claws and teeth that evolved for killing other animals. Hunting a wolf or a lion or a bear involves confronting an animal that has been selected by evolution specifically for its ability to fight effectively with the physical weapons it carries, which makes it a substantially more dangerous and more difficult prey target than a deer or aurochs of comparable size. The injury risk during a carnivore hunt, particularly in the close-range engagement that ancient hunting technology often required, was significantly higher than the injury risk during herbivore hunting of equivalent size. An injury in a world without medical care was potentially fatal long after the specific incident. Beyond the danger of the hunt itself, carnivores tend to be considerably warier and more behaviorally sophisticated than most herbivore prey species, reflecting the fact that carnivores are themselves experienced hunters who understand pursuit and ambush situations from the practitioner's perspective. You cannot approach a wolf from downwind with the same degree of straightforward tactical thinking you'd apply to a deer, because the wolf has spent its entire life using exactly those tactics on prey and will recognize them. Hunting animals that are themselves skilled hunters requires substantially more sophisticated strategy and significantly more uncertain outcomes than hunting prey animals whose primary defensive strategy is flight rather than fighting intelligence. The territorial behavior of large carnivores adds another dimension to why ancient humans generally avoided targeting them as food sources. Large carnivores maintain territories through aggressive defense against other individuals and groups of the same species, and attempting to kill a large carnivore in its own territory invites not just the response of the targeted animal, but potentially the response of others in the area attracted by the sounds of conflict. A wounded bear or lion in its own territory with multiple nearby conspecifics is a significantly more dangerous situation than a failed herbivore hunt in the same area. The disease and parasite burden carried by carnivores represents another practically significant factor that ancient humans likely learned about through observed outcomes, even without any understanding of the mechanisms involved. Carnivores, due to their position in the food chain and their consumption of raw animal tissue from many prey individuals, tend to carry higher parasite loads than herbivores. Various tapeworm species complete part of their life cycles in carnivore tissues, with different species being specific to different carnivore hosts. Trichinella and similar parasites that cycle through carnivore systems are present at higher prevalence and often higher intensity in carnivore muscle tissue than in herbivore muscle. Ancient humans consuming insufficiently processed carnivore meat would have encountered these parasites at higher rates than herbivore consumption of equivalent processing, and the outcomes of those encounters, illness, sometimes serious illness, would have been observed, remembered, and incorporated into the accumulated knowledge about which animals made people sick when eaten. Ancient human oral knowledge systems, which we've discussed extensively throughout this series, as the primary mechanism for transmitting practical survival information across generations, would have captured these illness associations even without understanding their parasitological mechanism. The practical conclusion, eating carnivores makes people sick more often than eating herbivores, would have been encoded in behavioral rules, food taboos, or cultural practices that discouraged carnivore consumption on grounds that seemed superstitious or arbitrary to later observers, but tracked a real empirical pattern. This is the same mechanism we discussed in our food safety video, where accurate practical knowledge of dangerous foods preceded mechanistic understanding by thousands of years. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Carnivore flavor is another factor that deserves honest examination because it's frequently overlooked in discussions of ancient dietary patterns, but was almost certainly practically significant. Animals that eat other animals consistently accumulate specific compounds in their tissues that produce distinct, often less palatable flavors than herbivore meat. The specific amino acid profiles of carnivore muscle tissue differ from herbivore muscle tissue in ways that affect flavor. High levels of uric acid and other nitrogenous waste products that accumulate in carnivore tissues due to their protein-heavy diets contribute characteristic flavors that human taste systems generally find less appealing than the flavor profiles of herbivore meat. The specific fat profiles of carnivores, reflecting the converted fats of multiple prey species accumulated through their diet, can produce stronger and less pleasant flavors during cooking than the fat profiles of herbivores. These flavor differences would have been immediately apparent to ancient humans with experience consuming both herbivore and carnivore meat. And flavor preferences are not trivial considerations in dietary decision-making, even when survival is the primary concern. When alternative food sources are available, the food that tastes better will be preferentially consumed. And when it comes to large prey animals, herbivores have historically tasted better to human palates than carnivores in most comparisons. This palatability difference reinforces all the other practical reasons for preferring herbivore prey, without requiring any explicit reasoning about nutrition or parasite load. The size to accessibility ratio of most large carnivores adds yet another dimension to the economic calculation. Large herbivores like mammoths, aurochs, and various deer species provide enormous quantities of meat, fat, and useful non-food materials from successful hunts, representing very favorable returns on hunting investment relative to their body mass. Large carnivores of comparable body mass, wolves, lions, hyenas, bears, are harder to kill, more dangerous to approach, carry more parasites, taste worse, contain less fat, and provide fewer useful secondary products relative to their body mass than comparable herbivores. When ancient hunters were evaluating where to invest their substantial hunting effort, the relative cost-benefit calculation of large herbivore versus large carnivore hunting came out overwhelmingly in favor of herbivores across essentially all meaningful dimensions simultaneously. The secondary products dimension deserves specific treatment because it's particularly illuminating about how ancient humans evaluated prey animals beyond pure meat value. Herbivore hides are better for clothing and shelter material than carnivore hides in most applications, being thicker, more uniform in texture, and more amenable to the tanning and working techniques that ancient humans developed for hide processing. Herbivore bone is more useful for tool making than carnivore bone in most applications due to size, density, and structural properties. Herbivore sinew and gut are more available in useful quantities than carnivore equivalents. Even herbivore stomach contents, the partially digested plant material that appears in excavated ancient sites with evidence of human consumption, provided plant-derived nutrients in a form that was easier to access than gathering the same plants directly in certain seasons. The comprehensive value comparison between herbivore and carnivore prey, accounting for meat quality, fat content, hide usefulness, bone usefulness, sinew availability, danger during hunting, and illness risk from consumption, makes the ancient human dietary preference for herbivores look less like an arbitrary cultural choice and more like a rational conclusion that reasonable people would arrive at independently given the same practical information. Ancient hunters with accumulated experience across all these dimensions would not have needed any explicit analytical framework to arrive at the practical conclusion that hunting herbivores was simply better than hunting carnivores across almost every relevant metric simultaneously. The ecological role of carnivores in ancient human environments adds another dimension to understanding why targeting them for food was not simply avoided, but may have been actively counterproductive from an enlightened self-interest perspective. Carnivore populations in healthy ecosystems regulate herbivore populations in ways that benefit the entire system, including ancient human hunters who depended on those herbivore populations for their primary food source. A region with healthy wolf populations tends to have healthy deer populations because wolf predation prevents overgrazing and maintains the habitat quality that supports deer. Ancient humans who systematically eliminated carnivore populations from their territories would potentially have created short-term hunting improvements, followed by herbivore population explosions, followed by habitat degradation, and herbivore population crashes that would ultimately reduce the food available to human hunters. Whether ancient humans understood this ecological dynamic explicitly in terms anything resembling modern ecology is doubtful. Whether they observed the associations between carnivore presence and herbivore availability over multiple generations and incorporated those observations into practical approaches to their relationship with carnivores is considerably more plausible. The accumulated wisdom of hunter-gatherer peoples regarding the appropriate relationship between human communities and carnivore populations in their territories has been documented in various traditional ecological knowledge systems as something considerably more nuanced than simple elimination of competitors, often involving specific practices and beliefs that maintained carnivore populations at levels compatible with shared landscape use. The cultural and ritual dimensions of ancient human relationships with large carnivores also contributed to the pattern of not eating them in ways that were distinct from purely practical dietary economics. We've discussed in our Animal Consciousness and Ancient Beliefs videos how ancient humans developed complex cultural relationships with certain animals that incorporated practical observation into frameworks of meaning that went beyond simple resource assessment. Large carnivores, particularly apex predators like lions, wolves, and bears, occupied significant positions in ancient human cultural and possibly spiritual frameworks that made them something other than simple potential prey. The cave art that ancient humans produced, featuring lions, bears, and wolves in prominent, often dramatically rendered compositions, suggests these animals carried specific cultural significance that separated them from the auroch and deer that also appear in cave art contexts, but in somewhat different typical configurations. Lions, in particular, appear in some of the most elaborate and carefully executed ancient European cave art compositions, in ways that suggest they were objects of significant attention, perhaps admiration or fear, or some combination of cultural significance that didn't translate into treating them as food animals in the way herbivore prey was treated. Large carnivores in the ancient world were also competitors and threats in a way that shaped the entire cognitive and emotional context of ancient humans' relationships with them. We've discussed in our predator survival video how ancient humans managed the constant presence of apex predators in their environments through behavioral strategies, fire, weapons, and group coordination. The species that ancient humans were actively strategizing to keep away from their camps and their children were not the same species they would most naturally consider food, regardless of whether there was any explicit cultural prohibition against it. The psychological category of dangerous threat and the psychological category of food tend to remain separate in most contexts, and ancient humans' consistent experience of large carnivores as genuine threats to their safety would have reinforced a perception of those animals as adversaries rather than resources. Bears represent an interesting exception to the general pattern that illustrates why the story is more nuanced than a simple rule about never eating carnivores. Bears appear at ancient human sites, with butchery evidence at somewhat higher rates than most other large carnivores. And this is consistent with bears occupying a somewhat different practical position than wolves or lions in the ancient human assessment. Bears are large, contain significant fat reserves, particularly in autumn before hibernation, are dangerous but more predictably so than some other large carnivores, and occupy territories in ways that can be navigated by alert hunters with reasonable strategic preparation. They also taste substantially better than most obligate carnivores because bears are actually omnivores, consuming large quantities of plant material, berries, roots, and fish alongside animal prey, which gives their meat a flavor profile considerably closer to herbivore meat than the tissue of an obligate carnivore like a wolf or lion. The omnivore status of bears is nutritionally and flavorologically significant because it means bear tissue doesn't accumulate the specific flavor compounds and parasite loads in quite the same way or to quite the same extent as obligate carnivore tissue. A bear that has been spending autumn eating berries and fish before hibernation is a nutritionally rich, relatively palatable, high-fat prey animal that presents practical challenges during hunting, but offers significantly better cost-benefit characteristics than an obligate carnivore of comparable size. The higher rate of bear consumption in ancient dietary records, compared to wolf or lion consumption, probably reflects exactly this practical difference rather than any arbitrary cultural distinction. Ancient human encounters with smaller carnivores present a different pattern again, with mustelids like martens and otters appearing at ancient sites occasionally as food remains, though still less frequently than herbivores. Small carnivores offer less direct hunting danger than large ones, require less coordinated hunting effort, and provide useful furs for clothing in addition to whatever nutritional value the meat provided. The practical economics of small carnivore hunting are more favorable than large carnivore hunting in specific dimensions, even though the overall preference for herbivore prey remains consistent. The comprehensive picture that emerges from examining all of these factors simultaneously is that ancient humans' general avoidance of carnivore consumption was not an arbitrary cultural taboo, not an oversight or failure to recognize carnivores as potential food, and not a result of insufficient hunger or nutritional desperation. It was a rational outcome of accumulated practical experience with all the ways in which carnivore hunting and consumption compared unfavorably to herbivore hunting and consumption across multiple simultaneous dimensions: caloric value, fat content, hunting danger, palatability, parasite risk, behavioral difficulty, and secondary material usefulness. Ancient hunters were conducting, through generations of accumulated observation and transmitted knowledge, a sophisticated cost-benefit analysis of their food acquisition options. And the consistent conclusion of that analysis was that herbivores were a dramatically better return on investment than carnivores across almost every relevant metric. This conclusion, arrived at through practical experience without any formal analytical framework, aligns remarkably well with what modern nutritional science and parasitology would predict from first principles about the relative value of herbivore versus carnivore meat as a human food source. Ancient humans were right about this for the right practical reasons, even though those reasons were encoded in behavioral patterns, cultural practices, and accumulated oral knowledge rather than in explicit analytical frameworks or scientific documentation. There's something worth noting about what this pattern of ancient dietary choices reveals about ancient human cognitive sophistication more broadly. The consistent, rational, multi-factor optimization of hunting decisions across an enormous range of environments, time periods, and specific ecological contexts represents a level of practical ecological intelligence that the popular image of ancient humans as instinct-driven, reactive, and cognitively limited simply cannot accommodate. Ancient hunters who were simultaneously evaluating prey animals across dimensions of caloric density, hunting risk, palatability, parasite risk, secondary material value, and ecological consequences of hunting pressure were doing something that deserves to be recognized as sophisticated applied ecology, even if it looked, from the outside, like simple daily survival activity. The wolves at the edge of the carcass in our opening scenario weren't being ignored as a food source because ancient hunters were failing to recognize an opportunity. They were being left alone because experienced hunters with access to accumulated multi-generational knowledge about costs and benefits of different prey types had concluded correctly that those wolves were better left to their own business. The aurochs they'd just brought down was the right choice. It had always been the right choice. And figuring that out and transmitting that knowledge effectively enough to make it a consistent cultural pattern across ancient human populations worldwide was one of those quiet achievements of ancient human cognitive sophistication that never gets the recognition it deserves.